evidently it's still done well, which surprises me because I feel like these games probably didn't sell very well in North America. Uh, but but I guess it must be doing well enough for us to keep getting versions of it. Uh, but anyway, uh, let's talk about Solatorobo. So it's kind of structured, and there was a part one which was up to the first end credit, and then part two was all the way up to the what we just saw. Part two is very much like a Disc 2 type feeling, like you might get with a lot of other games where like everything is kind of restarted, like Season 2 in anime and things like that. Part one, I gave an 80 score to. I'm like, if the game stops here, I'd give it an 80. I feel like I'm gonna give the game a 75, and I'm gonna explain my score. A 75 is like the bare minimum for me to give an active recommendation. That doesn't mean a 74 is this. You know, there's some wiggle room and there's some loose. Like a game can be okay, but I don't think it really deserves a score any higher than that. The main reason I gave the game an 80, because the game has a ton of strengths. Number one is the game just is beautiful to look at. I've never seen a DS game with towns and locations that have looked anywhere near as good as the locations have been in the game. There's a lot of influence with different locations and regions that are available on Earth for architecture. There was places based off of Italy, off of France, off of China, but just like the designs of a lot of these locations, especially when they changed perspective to let you see inside of stores and buildings, was really freaking cool. And I wish more games would actually have taken advantage of that. But I love traversing towns and exploring the areas. Combat, combat was a bit of a mixed bag. I happen to like it. I liked it in part one because of how simple it was. It's like Klonoa. You pick up enemies, you pick up objects, you can throw them at bosses, you can throw enemies at other enemies, and you can also stun enemies by throwing items at them that can also help you with being able to lift them. You'd need to do that mechanic later because there are certain armored enemies that you need to loosen their armor so that you can then eventually be able to lift them up to throw them. Uh, it was pretty easy, and you could chain bounce combos. If you threw an enemy in a bounce, you could grab it in midair, throw it again. And I found that to be pretty good. Again, there were no special moves, there were no finishers. I didn't think it really needed anything like that. The thing that really dragged the game down were the dungeons. The dungeons, aside from being visually bland and uninteresting, compared to the architecture and places we saw in the game, was that they were just like very narrow walkways with enemies that served more as obstacles rather than just actual challenges. Bosses, they gave you lots of space to run around in, like a clear arena for you to have a proper fight. But enemies were just fodder you would throw out of the way in these dungeons. It was not fun to travel through them. It was not fun to fight anything in them. And considering that's what you're doing for missions, what you're traversing dungeons and actually advancing the main story, uh, considering gameplay is super high on the hierarchy of rating a game, that really dragged down the game score. As much as I love the story, as much as I love the music, and I love the characters, I really did not like the dungeon designs and layouts. It's not even really a true RPG. There's levels, but levels only increase HP, which is like the bare minimum of really trying to have a level system. It didn't need it. You could have gotten rid of levels and it would have changed absolutely nothing, because you have P crystals that unlock the grid that's like 358 days over 2 with Kingdom Hearts. If you wanted to make levels useful, give bonus P crystal points for leveling up. Get like 2 per level or something to make levels feel like they're doing something other than just giving you health, which is absolutely pointless because you can work around health so easy. Uh, but overall, the thing that really was interesting about part 2 is It expanded the story. It expanded combat features. It gave you a trance feature, which is kind of like FF9 trance, the trance system that you could activate when you accrue enough tension and everything else. It also gave you, again, more missions, more locations, and despite it giving you more and more and more, I felt the game as a whole was worse. It felt this need to. It made the critical mistake of trying to explain and justify its world, which it absolutely did not need to do at all. Like, I've played Sky Gunner on the PlayStation 2. It has inhabitants that have a bunch of tails or like little tiny minions that talk in whoa, whoa, whoa speak, and I never once questioned why the world was the way that it was. But part two is like, hey, you want to know why there are all of these furry creatures running around? Why there are all of these floating land masses? Why there's a cloud sea like on Xenoblade Chronicles 2? And I'm like, no, I don't really. Well, this is a story all about how... And they just go into this long explanation that's not even a compelling way to tell it. It was an info dump. Now, having a overarching question that's lasting across your entire game that they eventually address in a lengthy cutscene, that's not an info dump. But when you introduce a concept just to overly explain it at that exact point, that is an info dump. And there are so many better ways to do it because it's the laziest way to introduce a concept. Like Red feeling all of this self-doubt and issues and questioning everything. Came relatively out of nowhere, and it felt like they kind of invented a problem that should have naturally just been explained in part 1, just to have something that they could do in part 2. The combat really got worse when they introduced the features. I felt it wouldn't have been an issue if they introduced it early. The problem with combat is that what I would do in part 1 for like the first 10 and 11 hours I played it, because I did every side quest, I would pick up enemies, throw them, and jump and pick them up, and you could throw them at other enemies, meaning that I would pick them up and I'd press the D-pad in the direction of the other enemy, and I could throw it at that enemy, it would hit that enemy, and it would stun them. So for 10 or 11 hours I was doing that. Part 2 decides, hey, you know what this game really needs? Finishing moves. And how do you activate the finishing moves, you ask? Well, if you happen to be holding an enemy, and you happen to hold a directional button while you throw them, you will execute a finisher, whether you're in the air or on the ground. You could probably see where I'm going with this. So when I was fighting things in part 2, and I was trying to toss enemies towards other enemies, you can't do that anymore. If you try to do that, you activate a combo finisher, which is lengthy, you can't cancel out of, and enemies can still hurt you during, which it doesn't really matter that they could hurt you during it, because you could survive basically anything without upgrading defense in this game. But it's frustrating that you have to experience misinputs that didn't ordinarily have to even exist at all. If they let you turn it off, that would be helpful. They did not let you turn it off. And so I was constantly trying to toss things to enemies to other enemies and just executing finishers by complete accident, just because the game decided to change its rules halfway through it, which is like a terrible time to try to introduce new mechanics. The story, it's basically got every anime trope you could think of. The lolly that's actually 300 years old, yeah, we've got one of those. We also have another character that looks like they're young, but there's actually 300 years old too, so we have two of them. L's eventual acceptance of Red, I felt, was a little bit too forced. I was annoyed at the way that it was handled, because it wasn't handled well. Because it was basically, she was very aloof in her conversations, distant, had very mysterious twinges to her dialogue whenever she was talking. But then Red walked in on Elle showering, And then the game's like, oh, you know what? She girl now, and because she girl, that means that she has to actually be talking with a more softer tone, has to be afraid of bugs, and all of these other anime tropes. Which, to be fair, you could play Blackout Bingo with all of the anime tropes in this game, but they could have organically introduced a scene or something to suddenly change her mysterious, more standoffish nature to a more warm and accepting character, but they didn't do that. They just had a shower scene where she was outed as a girl, and that entire dynamic just kind of crumbled, and she just stopped being that interesting character that she already was for no apparent reason. Um, but all things considered, I don't think the game is like a bad game. I wanted something simple. I wanted something handheld. This game fit the bill perfectly. It's a very portable, fun mission-based experience. It's got a lot of different side quests to keep you busy. It's got fun combat, or at least it was more fun in part one than part two. Sorry, and it's got very adorable characters and artwork. And visually the game just looks good. Like it absolutely looks incredible. Um, but with the dungeon problems, the forced combat issues, the second half, the info dumping they decided to do out of literally nowhere, where they could have just organically at least put loose threads in part one to make me more interested in finding out the answers in part two, rather than just kind of expanding on a story out of nowhere that I didn't really think needed to be expanded on, making me question a world that I would have just accepted without question. I don't know. But all things considered, I mean, it's a JRPG. It kind of comes with the territory sometimes. Uh, but yeah, those are my thoughts. I don't know if it was worth getting water for it or not, or I don't know if it was worth all the hype it was built up on. But I feel like the game itself, I mean, was a fun enough experience, and at some point I'll play the 2021 game. I don't want to go straight into it. I've been putting off Dark Cloud 2 for a while now. I kind of stopped it because I felt like it was too hard. But I think the problem was I was just too stubborn. Like, I was extremely stubborn with the game. And I think I came around, but I never got back to fully streaming it. I've got your game, Maculio. You are next. You are going to be the highlight on Tuesday. Assuming I'm going to try to test the game this weekend. Just make sure I'll just make sure everything works. First of all, I'm hoping my computer will run it without any issues. If I start running into issues with it, we can talk about whether or not there's another game you want me to try instead, because I downloaded it already. I'm just going to test it the weekend and see if everything works. If my computer blows up, we'll know it was a failure. But if it doesn't blow up, I think we'll be equipped to go ahead and just go straight forward with it. And well, let me see. Let me catch up. You didn't get to see much. Yeah, it seems like fair criticisms. Yeah, I mean, the game is good. Like again, like if somebody comes up and asks me, is the game good? I'm on the fence. Well, you're not gonna find it. You're gonna have to emulate it. It's like if the entire game, like box and all, was like $500, I think, right now. But the cartridge itself might be like 250. I don't know, but you're not gonna find a loose copy anywhere. I'm pretty sure. You'd probably, if you have somebody ask, hey, I've got my R4 card and I want to play this game. Should I play it? I'm gonna say yes. I'm not gonna go out and like urge people, hey, you got to play this game. That's like an 80 score or higher for me to do that, which this game almost was.